Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. With the economy at the top of everyone's mind, there are three critical questions that need to be answered. What exactly is the state of the economy today? How serious is it? And what should the government do? Those are the three key issues I shall explore today with India's former chief statistician and former chief economic advisor to the Planning Commission, Professor Pronab Sen. Professor Sen, let's start with the state of the economy today. We all know that GDP growth has slumped to 5%, but when you look beyond that, you discover that there are a whole range of sectors which are either declining or stagnating. Manufacturing growth and agricultural growth have badly slumped. Investments are falling. Private consumption seems to have more or less collapsed. And on top of that, exports have been stagnant for 5 years, and now, in fact, in the last couple of months, they seem to be shrinking. The only thing it seems that's rising is unemployment and FPI outflows, and of course the foreign exchange reserves. So what does this tell us about the state of the economy today?
Well, the state of the economy is serious. And let's not underplay the magnitude of the problem that we are facing. So we are seeing a 5% headline number, and as you said, that hides a lot of stories. But the main thing that we really need to take into account is that as far as employment is concerned, the informal sector, which had been the main driver of employment for the longest time in Indian economic history, that's been in the doldrums now for a while. But corporate employment was going up, and it was going up quite strongly. It was going up at about 4 to 5% a year. That seems to have turned. So whatever employment growth was happening seems to have reversed now. The informal sector is coming back, but it's not coming back sufficiently to make up for what's happening. The other number which you really should take note of is, everybody gets very worked up about motor vehicle sales and, what a terrible thing it is for us middle class. But the fact of the matter is, the really serious news is that commercial vehicle sales have slumped, which means that the trucking industry feels that there is not going to be enough goods for movement. Now that's, as a lead indicator, that's a very good one, because what it's saying is people are not, they don't need us to move goods into or out of their factories and workshops. So it bodes ill for the immediate future.
To explain to laymen when commercial vehicle sales stop or collapse, it actually suggests that the manufacturers of those vehicles have begun to realize that there's going to be no demand for the future.
No, the truckers are realizing it.
Because they know that their business is shrinking.
Their business is.
And as a result, they're not purchasing, and that is a clear sign that in the weeks and months to come, the economy is likely to shrink further.
That is right, because this is a negative growth. It is actual fall, which means even replacement purchases are not happening.
And when you mention that, in fact, even unemployment in the organized sector, which was growing at a respectable 4%, has now begun to shrink, that means that people will become unemployed, which means that demand will further shrink, which will in turn affect production and in turn affect growth.
This is right.
So we have a spiraling process which suggests that things are going to get a lot worse before there's even a glimmer of hope.
These are the indications that we have today.
Now, you began by saying that let's not kid ourselves, this is a serious situation, but as you've explained it, it actually feels a bit like a crisis.
Well, I wouldn't go so far as saying it's a crisis, but the situation is grim and something really needs to be done about it, and it needs to be done now.
I'll come to what needs to be done in a moment's time, but let me first put two responses from the government literally in the last week. To begin with, the Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman said that the biggest decline in car sales in 20 years could at least be partly explained by the fact that millennials prefer Uber and Ola. And almost a day later, the Minister for Commerce and Industry, Piyush Goyal, said that we shouldn't focus too much and take too seriously the statistics and the math behind the GDP figure. And many people felt that these responses suggest that the government hasn't really woken up to the seriousness of the situation. Do you share that feeling?
Well, let me put it this way. There is often a discrepancy between the public pronouncements of government and what they are thinking of and trying to do inside closed doors. I hope that is true. If it isn't, then it would imply that they're in a state of denial.
You're giving them a benefit of the doubt.
Well, I've been in government, right? Now, in government, quite often for political reasons, you don't necessarily speak your mind. But that doesn't mean that you don't recognize the problem and work on fixing it.
But is it appropriate for ministers to be jocular about the problem? It's one thing to not recognize the gravity of it because you don't want to depress people.
That's right.
But to be jocular about it might suggest that you're not even facing up to it.
I hope that is not the case. If it is, then we are in deeper trouble than I thought.
Before I come to this critical question, what should we do? And associated with that will be the question, is the government doing it? I want to first ask you, what do you as an economist believe is the cause of the problem? What's brought our economy to this rather grim juncture?
There's several reasons, some of them going back into the past, some of them of a more recent origin. So what we had was a situation where the economy actually came out of the global crisis fairly smartly. And
This is 2008.
This is 2008. So by 11-12, we were doing really well. And then 12-13 came, and that was a bad year. It was a bad year both for policy as well as for global development. So you first had, a whole bunch of cases which has been cited by some people, things like the coal scam, judgment by the Supreme Court cancelling coal orders. A lot of power plants were suddenly deprived of their feedstock. So you had, that story playing out.
And there was 2G as well.
And then you had the 2G scam also playing. So you had all of that happening, and then you had the taper tantrums happening in the global economy, and everything seemed to go down the tube altogether. But since 13-14, the economy started again picking up and growing very strongly, in fact. So our fundamentals were still okay. Inflation was a bit high, but that's something I don't really complain about because it had a positive dimension. And we were starting to move towards the peak when demonetization happened. And everything got rolled back. So, now, I think the belief that demonetization didn't have a longer term effect is misplaced. And unless you recognize the nature of the disruption that took place, it's going to be very difficult to figure out what measures should be taken. And let me try and give you a feel for the kinds of things that went on. First of all, think of what happens when cash goes out of what is largely a cash economy.
86%.
Well, of employment, about 45% of our GDP. Now the cash gets pulled out. If you look at the middle class and upper middle class discourse, we talk a lot about liquidity for corporates and how liquidity shortages are binding. For the cash economy, it's cash, which is the liquidity. And cash just vanishes overnight. What happens? Firms there are unable to pay their bills. Firms there then start negotiating with each other. They give informal credit to each other just to stay afloat. What they cannot negotiate, because unless the government comes in, it becomes non-negotiable, is bank loans. Bank loans have to be paid back within 90 days of its being due. Otherwise, you get put as a stressed asset. And 1 year later, you become an NPA. And once that happens, you'll never get a bank loan again. Right? Now, to some extent, this particular problem got taken care of by these companies actually borrowing through Mudra. Mudra came as a godsend to them for this. But the problem, of course, was Mudra just kicked the can down the road. So that if the economy didn't improve, you'd have to pay the Mudra loans back too. That's where we are today.
People are, in a sense, in double debt.
They are in double debt.
Debt to the banks, debt to Mudra, and the economy hasn't improved.
Hasn't improved, so they're unable to pay. So Mudra loans are going to be a huge drag on the banking system, but much more importantly, it's going to put a whole lot of small entrepreneurs out of business.
And this has affected GDP growth badly.
It will affect GDP growth, and more importantly, it's relatively easy to replace a lot of things. It is relatively difficult to replace an entrepreneur. Entrepreneurs are not that common.
So when entrepreneurs go under, you actually have an even worse situation.
You have a worse situation, and the entrepreneurs go under, and the banks will not lend to them again.
So you've explained that what demonetization did, just as the economy was picking up and gathering speed.
No, in fact, it was about getting to its peak. In another year, would have hit the highest growth that we'd have seen in a long time.
Just as it was hitting its peak,
you had
demonetization literally cut the legs off under the economy.
Whole story.
By sucking out liquidity, it affected all transactions that happen in cash. It worst of all hit the unorganized sector, which is pretty close to 45% of the economy. This meant that people got sucked into debt to try and recover. Their entrepreneurial businesses collapsed. What about employment? Was that another aspect of the problem?
No, that is the second part of it. The second part of the story, which is important, and again, I think there is less than adequate recognition, is that one very major component of the cash economy was agricultural trade. Not agricultural production, that's a separate story. Agricultural trade. Agricultural traders simply had no money to buy agricultural produce. Prices crashed. Farmers were not getting income. They had production. They had goods to sell, but there were no buyers. This problem is still not fixed. And it's partially fixed, but not in its entirety, because what you went and did is, in addition to demonetization, you put in a rule which said that any cash withdrawal from a bank above 50,000 rupees automatically gets reported to the income tax authorities. So what you did in effect, maybe that was the intent, and perhaps it was the intent, is you put the fear of God in the trader, right? So now think of a trader who, when he goes to the mandi, is probably working in lakhs of rupees. If he has to withdraw less than 50,000 at a time, it's going to take him a long time to build his corpus back up again, even if he has money in the bank.
So agricultural trade also got badly affected by demonetization.
Which is why agriculture prices went into negative territory.
And did that lead to unemployment?
Yes, it did, because what happened is you took away a huge amount of demand. Remember, agriculture accounts for 42% of your workforce. If there's an actual reduction in their income, it's going to show up in the demand for all other
which will again hit production,
which will hit
growth.
Which will hit employment, it will hit growth.
So then demonetization had a sort of double effect.
Yes.
It crippled businesses by sucking cash out.
Yep.
It affected them in terms of employment. They lost jobs, therefore their demand fell, therefore production fell. And so it became a vicious spiral downwards.
This is right.
And this is something that has reflected itself in the 5% slump in growth that we're seeing.
It has finally come home to roost, yes. So basically what had happened is that over that period, the corporate sector was doing all right because they were not cash dependent. Now, in a situation of that kind, the incomes that are generated from the corporate sector can sustain growth for a while. But the problem is that eventually you need new customers to come into the market.
And they aren't
And
there.
they were not there.
You've sketched out in considerable detail the manner in which demonetization affected the economy, and as you said, it is still an effect we're living with, which is why growth has slumped to 5%.
Yes.
But this is not something the government recognizes, and certainly their jocular responses that I mentioned earlier are clearly an attempt not just to cover, but not even to look at this problem.
Well, as I said, if they're covering, I'm okay with it. If they are not looking at it, then the problem is serious.
Do we have any hint that suggests they are looking at it? That behind this jocular front, they're aware of the crisis they have themselves created?
Well, I thought they did.
You've
but
phrased
maybe I
that
was
in
wrong.
the past tense. You phrased it in the past tense.
I phrased it in the past tense. And the reason I did is that one decision was taken which I thought could actually begin the process of reversal of this downward spiral you're talking about. That was PM Kisan. PM Kisan was announced last year around October or November or thereabouts somewhere.
And universalized.
Well, the universalization came later.
No.
But what happened then was in a supplementary demand for grants, some 18,000 crores was appropriated and it was actually sent out. Right? The problem is it wasn't followed up. So if you look at the interim budget, 25,000 crores had been provided for PM Kisan, and when the final budget was presented in July, which is 4 months down the road, you find that 25,000 crores was left unspent, which means after that first tranche of PM Kisan, nothing seems to have happened.
And another thing happened in the final budget. Even though the Prime Minister had universalized the scheme, which meant an additional 15,000 crore, that additional 15,000 wasn't also accounted for.
It was not.
So you're saying that, in fact, after the initial tranche or two of PM Kisan, the remainder is...
Well, as far as I know, only one tranche.
I thought it was two, but maybe
But
it's not.
maybe.
But after that initial one or two,
Yeah.
either the rest have not been adequately budgeted for, or worse still,
No, they were budgeted. No,
but not paid out.
But not paid out.
So
So,
the government is
in the
sitting on the
interim
money.
budget, I have a provision for 25,000 crores. And when I look at the final, the actual budget in July, I find 25,000 crores has been shown as unspent.
So what you're saying is that PM Kisan, which could have alleviated the situation, given money to people who are unemployed, created demand
right.
and revived production,
That's right.
is money the government is sitting on, it's not actually giving to people.
This is correct.
And as we pointed out earlier, the money that's required additionally for the universalization hasn't even been budgeted
Hasn't
for.
even been budgeted.
So really what could have saved the economy, PM Kisan, is actually not happening because the government's not implementing it.
But I don't know why it's not happening. I mean, this is the thing. One would have thought that this was in fact, that's what I thought originally, that this was a recognition of the nature of the damage that had been caused. But now, in retrospect, since the further tranches have not gone out, one gets the feeling that this was essentially with the eye only to the elections. Now, that would be a very sorry tale
And
to
this
tell.
is why today you deliberately use the phrase in the past tense, I thought. No longer do you so think. Now you do believe that in fact the government is simply being jocular because it doesn't want to recognize the reality.
This is my fear.
Let me come back to this reality. Is the problem we face a cyclical problem or a structural problem?
Well, if you think of what I've been saying, this
Sounds
is
very
structural.
structural.
There is nothing cyclical about it.
So when the RBI actually goes out of its way to say it's a soft patch mutating into a cyclical downswing rather than a deep structural slowdown, the RBI is not being totally honest. This is a structural slowdown.
Yes.
Several economists have gone on record to say that from this, we're not going to revive growth very quickly. Many believe that in fact over the next quarter or two, you could see it dip even below 5%. Would you agree?
This is correct, yes.
How low could we go? Is it almost impossible to say?
It is impossible to say, and much depends upon how much stress starts appearing in the corporate sector. In the automobile sector, we already know the stress. We can see it, 350,000 people have been laid off. There are some other sectors in cement, for instance, layoffs are happening. How bad it gets will depend upon how quickly the corporates start shedding jobs and therefore continuing the downward spiral.
And that we don't know as yet.
We don't know as yet.
But there is reason to believe that we're nowhere near the bottom.
This is correct. Although, there are some, so the index of industrial production has gone up a little bit, nothing to really crow about, but it has improved slightly. Let's hope that's sustained. Because if it isn't, then we'll be going backward.
Writing in the Business Standard just a couple of days ago, Shankaracharya, former chief economic advisor, said that there are three factors that lead him to believe that in fact the situation is not going to revive quickly and could in fact dip further.
That's right.
First, he said, you have an international global economy that has softened. He says there are major economies like the American, the French, the British, the Chinese, the German, which have actually begun to decelerate. Then he said, looking at the internal situation, there are several worrying indicators. Car sales and cement, as you mentioned, tax revenues, company returns, and although the IIP has improved, it's only been a one-off improvement so far.
So far.
And then the third thing he said is that people don't believe the government is either adequately facing up to the problem, and certainly it's not adequately responding. And he thinks the combination of these three makes it almost certain, or at least very likely, that growth will slide down further.
Yeah.
Do you agree with that?
We're saying essentially the same story. All right. One can add bells and whistles to that. For instance, take a fairly simple case of the budget numbers, right? So we see that in the budget we find that tax collections have been lower by 1.7 trillion rupees, right? And you have an almost matching reduction in expenditures. Then what you do is you set an unrealistic target for taxes this year. Now all of this has very adverse effects. Number one, when you say that you have spent 1.7 trillion rupees less last year so as to keep the fiscal deficit under control, what the government is saying in effect is not that they haven't spent the money, it's that they haven't paid their bills. So you have a whole bunch of people out there who expect money back from the government, either payment for something that the government has bought or refund of taxes already paid. That money is simply not being given. So in a sense, you're compounding their problem.
Because now they can't carry on any business
any further.
And your inability or refusal to pay them becomes a huge problem for them, which in turn becomes a problem for the rest of the economy because people that they owe money to won't be paid.
Won't be paid.
So there's a vicious chain.
So there's a chain along that.
In which case, at this point, let me ask you, from this situation that we face today, what are the chances that we're going to become a $5 trillion economy in 5 years' time?
Look, maybe not in 5 years, but that is not the point. If you remember, when Mr. Atal Bihari Vajpayee became the Prime Minister, he gave a target for the 10th five-year plan, which was double per capita income in India in 10 years, right? Now, what that required was the economy to grow sustained basis at 7.5%. Until then, we'd been hanging around 5.5 to 6. So this was a challenge. And when we developed the 10th plan, what we found is that there's no way you're going to jump to 7.5 overnight. And so it was a game plan which says that we are going to start at about 5.5 to 6%.
But push ourselves up.
But we'll push ourselves up to 9% later.
So it became an ambition that in a sense inspired better performance.
A better performance and forced us to think about what is it that we needed to do in order to get to that.
And therefore you see the commitment to become a $5 trillion economy in much the same way.
In much the same way. So whether it happens in 5 years or it happens in 7 years is really not the issue. The issue is, are you going to do what is needed to push growth to 8%?
Except at the moment, it seems we are not. To be able to become a $5 trillion economy in 5 years, we should be growing in nominal terms at 12%, in actual terms at around 8 or 9%.
Around 8%.
At the moment, in nominal terms, we've just about made 8%, and that's because inflation is low.
That's right.
And in real terms, and it's falling, and in real terms, we're at 5. So if we continue the way we are, and worse still, if we dip further, we're not going to achieve it even in 7 years.
Well, we don't know. The more important question, to my mind, is what's your game plan?
And that isn't known.
That's unknown. We have no idea of what the game plan is to get to the 5 trillion. Now, if you have a game plan and it's a reasonable, rational game plan, then whether the date gets stretched a little bit doesn't really matter.
It's the achievement, not the date.
And not the date.
You raise this critical question, we don't have a game plan. If we do, no one knows what it is. The government is hiding it. Let's therefore come to an associated subject. What should the government do? And I'm going to break that question up into two. I want to ask you, what should the government do in terms of immediate short-term measures? And secondly, what are the sort of longer-term structural reforms that must also be tackled? Do you believe that of the immediate short-term steps that are necessary, reviving demand is perhaps the most important?
Reviving demand, for the immediate problem, reviving demand is absolutely critical.
But how?
And as I said, to me, PM Kisan is a good way to start. You've already got all the approvals in place. You presumably have a certain amount of the infrastructure, the institutional infrastructure in place. Shouldn't be a big trick to actually start pushing that money out.
Except that for bizarre reasons that we can't understand, the government isn't.
The government isn't.
It's sitting on the money and not doing anything.
That's number one. Number two is recognize where the problem lies. And the problem lies in agriculture and the informal sector. That's where the problem originates. Which means put your focus on those sectors.
Do we need special measures for the informal sector and special measures
you
for
don't
agriculture?
Need special measures. Public investments are a good thing. The point is there are public investments and there are public investments. So I can build a national highway, 8-lane national highway, or I can build 20 rural roads. Right?
Rural roads is what you need today.
Rural roads is what you need today because there you're hiring local contractors, you're hiring local labor, you are not hiring a large construction company using mechanized.
So even someone like Nitin Gadkari, who talks a lot about the roads and is committed to building them,
yes,
should change his focus, at least for a time being, from national to rural, for a couple of years.
For a couple of years.
So
I'm not saying this should be permanent. So it's rural roads, rural housing, put more money there. It can be nobody's case that we already have a surplus of rural. We've got a surplus of urban housing for sure. We know these developments which are sitting there empty. But rural housing is still a major issue. A very large chunk of our people still live in kacha houses. Small irrigation projects. Forget about large dams. Forget about river linking projects. Think in terms of ponds, micro irrigation, stuff like that. Again, focus on the rural, focus on what employs local people and not machinery.
Do you have any reason to believe that the government is focusing on these things?
Not if the budget is anything to go by.
What about the unorganized sector? That's another area where you said the distress is particularly deep.
The government doesn't have any real way of reaching out to the unorganized sector. Mudra was the closest we came to it. But unfortunately, the ammunition in Mudra has already been spent in people just keeping themselves afloat. So you're going to see a whole bunch of people who are going to go down the tube because they can't repay Mudra loans. So who are you going to give the Mudra loans to in the future?
And when they go down the tube, the problem in the unorganized sector will become considerably
will be worse. So one of the things that you should be considering is really to put a moratorium on the recognition of NPAs in Mudra loans. Instead of doing it the moment the default occurs, say, I'm giving you a moratorium of another 6 months or whatever.
So you give yourselves a little bit more time
before
you hit the crisis.
That's right.
But we're talking about, and as you said, the critical thing to do at the moment is to revive demand. Does this mean the government should actually consider letting the fiscal deficit grow? Would that be a mistake?
No, I think letting the fiscal deficit grow is okay. I would much rather than let the fiscal deficit grow than what we are experiencing today, where you are meeting your fiscal deficit targets by not paying your bills.
So rather than actually...
So you have a hidden fiscal deficit, you're not recognizing it, and you're making a whole bunch of poor suckers who expect government to pay its bills, sitting around waiting and suffering.
The government seems to be particularly reluctant to listen to people who say let the fiscal deficit grow. Should they therefore then let their disinvestment target balloon? Is that another way of providing money that they need?
Well, first of all, the government does seem to be fixated on the reported fiscal deficit. The fact is the hidden fiscal deficit
is huge.
Is already huge.
In fact,
just recognize it, for God's sake.
The CAG says the actual fiscal deficit is 5.8%.
That's right. So it's massive. Just recognize it. If it's there, recognize it. We will all be better off for it, because then we can start the process of consolidation of the fiscal deficit over time. But if you're in denial, you keep kicking that can down the road.
You've sketched out the critical need to revive demand. You've spoken about the critical steps that are necessary to revive demand, both in terms of rural India and agriculture and in terms of the unorganized sector. Let's look at this now in the light of what steps the government's taken. It seems to me that many, if not practically all the steps the government has taken tend to be on the supply side.
This is correct.
I'm talking about the merger of banks. I'm talking about the provision of 70,000 extra crore to banks for credit at a time when people aren't even borrowing from banks. I'm talking about making life easier for the automobile sector. And then, of course, there are such other things as scrapping the surcharge or the angel tax and changing the fact that no longer will infringement of corporate social responsibility lead to criminal prosecution.
That's right.
None of these are really demand-side measures.
No, they're all supply-side measures.
So doesn't that suggest that this government is not just being jocular because it wants to put up a brave face and not depress people? It's actually not recognizing the problem, not responding adequately. It's responding in supply terms rather than demand terms.
Yes, that's one way of looking at it. The other is that perhaps the government doesn't have proper economic advice from inside.
That is even more damning. I mean, you're actually suggesting, but you said it very politely, that the people on whose advice the government depends are not proper and adequate. They don't have a full understanding of the problem.
Well, let me put it this way. I'm almost certain they have an understanding of the problem, but apparently their understanding of the problem and my understanding of the problem, or Shankaracharya's understanding of the problem, is very different. Now, we can argue whose understanding is better. But unfortunately, the indicators suggest that at least the steps that the government has proposed are not going to work. So you have the SBI chairman who's coming out and said, look, I have 1 lakh crore of loanable funds available with SBI. I don't have takers. So if you increase that to 1.5 lakh crores, I'll still not have takers. Right? Address it.
And when the SBI chairman says this in public,
yes,
surely the finance minister and her advisors should sit up and say, hang on a second, we may be walking down the wrong road, we need to take another path, because the supply side problem which we keep addressing is not a problem.
Presumably the RBI should be taking into account, but after all, the RBI is talking with the banks all the time.
And it's funny, the RBI chairman should have also communicated to the government that, by the way, I've got enough money. The problem is not my shortage of funds. The problem is no one wants to borrow
the money.
And the government should have been told by him, address the demand side. Don't keep banging on with the supply side. Let's come now, by coming to the end of this interview, to a couple of specific suggestions that have been made and ask whether you agree with them. Dr. Manmohan Singh, in an interview to Business Line on the 12th, said that the top priority, or rather one of the top priorities, is to radically simplify and rationalize GST, even if it means a loss in revenue in the short term. Would you agree with that?
Well, again, on GST, I think there are a lot of issues that one really needs to think through. So I don't quite know what Dr. Manmohan Singh means by simplifying and rationalizing. One of the things I think we need to recognize, Karan, is that India is one of the few countries where GST has been implemented without riots. In most countries, there have been bloodshed. In Malaysia, they finally had to roll it back. It got so bad. My take is the reason this has happened, that in India it's gone through with all the glitches, is because we didn't change the fundamental structure of our taxation system, which is that essentials had low taxes and luxuries had high taxes. So nobody felt that the tax system was discriminating against them. If you start trying to rationalize this too quickly, moving towards a single rate or a limited number of rates, that charge is going to come. And that could be extremely disruptive.
And you're also suggesting that at the moment, with the situation as it is, this may be possibly the straw that breaks the camel's back.
That is right.
So you're also saying, Dr. Manmohan Singh, and you're saying it respectfully, I don't agree with you. This is not a priority at this moment.
No, but what is a priority? What is a priority is the fact that in the GST refunds are not happening. Now, whether that is a problem which is inherent in the design of GST, which it could be, or it is a part of the unwillingness of the government to pay out the money that it owes.
Although Nirmala Sitharaman did make a commitment in her press conference that this hold-up of GST refunds would be ended, money would be paid faster.
We've been hearing this for the last 2.5 years.
So this is just rhetoric?
Well, I don't know. I hope it happens. Because, this is serious.
Dr. Manmohan Singh also identified 4 sectors of the economy which he said were job intensive, which he said needed, and I'm quoting him, assured priority lending, especially for MSMEs. And these are textiles, automobiles, electronics, affordable housing. Affordable housing, in a sense, dovetails with what you talked about, rural housing. What do you say about the other 3? Textiles?
Well, MSME also I talked about.
Yeah.
I mean, as I said, that for Mudra was a good scheme. Unfortunately, Mudra is in trouble because of what has happened. Think of a way to keep it afloat, because otherwise Mudra terminates shortly.
As you said, extend the deadline so they don't become NPAs.
NPAs.
In the meantime, are these 3 good sectors to concentrate
So they're certainly very good sectors to concentrate on. The real question again is that, if you think about automobiles, one needs to be very clear as to what you would need to revive it. Because again, if we agree that it's a demand problem, reviving demand is something that the government cannot directly do. I mean, the government can't pay me money to go buy a car, right? But so it has to think about how it increases my opportunities and my income so that I will go and buy a car. That's a somewhat longer term process. I mean, it's not going to happen overnight. It's not a handout. Strategizing, I think the point he's trying to make is think about it in terms of strategizing the response. At the moment, we are not hearing of strategies. So we are hearing of reducing GST.
Should be directed to these specific sectors
This
and
is
to
correct.
MSMEs within them.
Within them, in particular.
What about exports? It is conventionally thought of as one of the engines that fires the economy, and certainly Piyush Goyal believes that it should be at least $1 trillion by the time we become a $5 trillion economy.
Yeah, and we are theory on 30
absolutely,
billion.
and we've been there roughly for the last 5 years. And now in August, there are signs of shrinkage. So is this another priority area the government should be focusing on?
The export should have been a priority area right from the beginning. Why it wasn't, I do not know. But exports have suffered for a range of reasons. The first reason is that non-refund of GST is most egregious in the export sector. Exporters are and have for a while now been in deep trouble because they are not getting the GST refunds, and as a result their working capital is stretched because they're using the working capital to finance the export rather than finance the production. Now that's not a good situation to be in.
What are the other problems?
The second problem, of course, is that over this period, particularly over the last 3 years, the rupee has appreciated and appreciated significantly. It's almost 15%. Now, if you think about exports, normally in exports you are talking about margins of 2 to 3%. You have a 15% increase in...
That kills your profit off completely.
It kills your profit completely.
But this is the government that takes great pride from the appreciation of the rupee. It doesn't realize that this actually works against the interests of exporters.
This is correct. And and what surprises me is that the exporters are not screaming about it.
So here we're talking about the need for the government to actually change its thinking, its mindset as they call it.
Yeah.
Don't think of a strong rupee as an economic asset.
That's
A
right.
weak rupee helps exports, and your exports will only grow if they're competitive because your rupee is weak.
This is correct.
But is this government likely to even accept that a shrinking of the price of the rupee is the answer to the problem?
Up to a point, perhaps it has accepted it, because if you look at what the RBI has been doing for the last year and a bit, it's been pumping money into the system. Now, strategically, that's not a bad thing to do to weaken the rupee, because if you actually try to weaken the rupee by essentially buying dollars, you're going to have Mr. Trump sitting on your head and accusing you of currency manipulation, right? So just expanding the supply of rupees in the system is a good way of weakening the rupee. So I hope that's a part of the ball game, but because that's what we have seen.
But surely
RBI
they
do.
need to do more of it.
They
bring
need
the
to
P
do
down.
a lot more of it.
And they need to be aware of the fact that
This is
the
right.
rhetoric, a strong rupee is a matter of national pride, is a mistaken way of viewing the economy.
Yes.
Finally, what are the structural problems the structural reforms which are necessary longer term measures that the government must take, and now?
See, as far as structural reforms are concerned, one of the things we simply don't seem to recognize, and this again, it's a part of our sort of economic history, and it's got hardwired, particularly among our generation, and that is that India is a supply constrained economy. Now, when a system is supply constrained, you don't need flexible labor laws, because the economy is not going to be going down, it's just going to be going up. But when you recognize the existence of business cycles, and by the way, we have had business cycles since the mid-90s, so we are 20 years into business cycles, then companies need the flexibility to be able to grow when the boom is happening
And
shrink when the bust happens. If you don't permit that, companies sort of go into a kind of an average mode.
Or choose to remain small,
That's choose
as
to remain
Krishna Swami Subramaniam said in his economic survey.
This is exactly correct.
But do you see this government biting the bullet of labour reform? Because what we're talking about is some measure of permission for hire and fire.
Well, you see, it's not just hire and fire. Up to a point, yes. One can introduce these things gradually. You don't have to have a blanket hire and fire. You can say that so long as a company is not laying off more than X percent, so let's say 7%, 10% of its workforce, it does not require permission.
X percent per year?
At any given time, yeah, per year.
At any given time?
Yeah,
Which could mean you could do it 3-4 times in a year.
you could.
To what extent is this need? I'm calling it hire and fire, you used a different terminology, but we're talking about the same thing, and you're suggesting more politically acceptable ways of doing it by putting percentage limits on how
Right.
much you can lay off at any one time, but you could lay off overall in a year quite a lot of people.
Well, we could put limits on that as
To
well.
what extent is the need for this actually taken care of by the fact that this government in its last avatar introduced what's called the fixed term employment policy? Or is that an inadequate substitute?
It is an inadequate substitute, because what that is essentially contract employment. That's all it is.
And it also doesn't take care of people who have set up companies in the past where they
That is
can't.
right.
Where they can't lay off
but
people and they're stuck with them.
those guys were using labor contractors. So all that the fixed term contract is doing is that instead of going through a labor contractor, you're contracting directly yourself. That's all you're doing, but it's still contract.
What about land? Is there a need to address the land
Look,
problem?
I am basically of the opinion that land is an issue, but I don't think we can do very much about it.
For political reasons?
For political reasons. Remember, every political party, practically every politician, a large chunk of his or her resources come from land decisions. And most of it has to do essentially with changing the land use classification. A huge amount of political money gets made.
So you're suggesting that sensible, adequate land reform will actually kill the golden goose that
That is
provides
right.
finances for
That's right.
political parties?
Yeah. So it's too close to those who have to take the decision.
Except that, to be honest, Mr. Modi did attempt it with 3 ordinances in his first term.
Yes.
He didn't succeed.
No.
Since then, he hasn't attempted it again.
No.
He's passed the buck both in terms of land and labour to state governments, and a very small number have tried to do things. But the largest
that
number
also
have not.
nothing particular. See, again, think of numbers. So what did Rajasthan do? We keep talking about Rajasthan as a place where labour laws have been modified. All they did was increase the
100 to
limit
300.
from 100 to 300.
Which is
300
marginal.
Doesn't matter. I mean, when we are talking about, and the sectors that Dr. Manmohan Singh were talking about, you should be thinking in terms of 10,000. And these are cyclical. These are very cyclical. Remember, the global economy is cyclical.
So we've reached a very interesting position on reform. You do believe there is a need for labour reform. There is a politically acceptable way of doing it. The question is whether the government has a will or not.
That's right.
But when it comes to land, although you believe land reforms are necessary,
Yes.
you don't think they'll happen. And the reason is that the golden goose that provides necessary funding would be killed with land
That's
reform.
right. That's right.
So that's an albatross the Indian economy is going to have
We
to
can
live
live
with.
with it.
They will.
We will live with it, and I think we'll manage to get around it.
The more urgent, it seems to me, if I hear you correctly, is tackle the labour one.
At the moment, I think it's more doable. And I think it's something we should have done 20 years ago. But if we don't do it now, then when the global economy comes surging back, as it will sooner or later,
We'll be in no position to
we will
benefit.
be in no position to capitalize on it.
So in other words, this is a now or never.
This is correct.
Professor Sen, a pleasure speaking to you.
Enjoyed it very much.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.